Welcome back to Normal Islands Live. It's really good to be back in the seat. I'm Curtis Daly. I will be your host this evening, and I'm joined by Turn Left contributor Antifa-cog. How are you tonight?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. Really looking forward to the show. I really like some of the changes you've been making and that the audience are going to see throughout the sort of like media show of the show that's coming up. Should be good.
Well, yeah, I mean, as we grow, things are going to be changing and trying to look more and more professional. We're getting there, but we're doing our best. As I said, it's good to be back in the seat, the hot seat, as I like to say. Now, we're doing a special because there's going to be 5 stories we're covering this evening. That will be Macron siding with Le Pen to keep the left out of government, Labour MP Jazz Arwell being a slum landlord, Jeremy Corbin forms an independent alliance, UK police charge co-founder of Palestine Action under the Terrorism Act, and David Lammy has announced they've suspended 30 arms export licenses to Israel. Now, let's go on to our first story. Emmanuel Macron has decided to go against the will of the people in the French elections by ignoring the candidate put forward by the left-wing alliance, despite winning the most seats. Macron has ruled out naming a left-wing government to end the country's political deadlock, saying it will be a threat to institutional stability. Macron has been searching in successive rounds of talks for a new prime minister since elections in July, gave a left-wing alliance the most seats in parliament, but not enough to govern. The president rejected left-wing claims to govern after talks Monday with far-right politician Marine Le Pen and other political leaders. Since Friday, he has invited party leaders to talks in the hopes of finding a consensus candidate who would not immediately be ousted in a no-confidence vote. Now, France Unbowed, also known as LFI, unfortunately, won't be accepting this without a fight. The NFP, particularly the hard left France Unbowed, has demanded for their right to form a government. The party argued that since it won the most seats, it should pick the new prime minister. It has chosen Lucie Castex, 37, as its candidate. However, Macron's party, along with the Conservatives and the far right, have promised to vote no confidence in a left-wing government. Now, it's clear there seems to be a crisis purely of Macron's own making, but the left are looking to see if he can be impeached. The Assemblée Nationale and Senate can and must defend democracy against the president's authoritarian leanings. LFI lawmakers wrote in a draft impeachment resolution. Their parliamentary leader, Mathilde Panot, said they had sent the document to other MPs to gather signatures. Any attempt to oust Macron via the impeachment process outlined in Article 68 of France's constitution faces high hurdles to success, ultimately requiring 2/3 of members to the Assembly and Senate combined to approve it. LFI argues that it's not up to the president to do political horse trading, taking aim at Macron's efforts since July to find a prime minister who would not be immediately ousted in a confidence vote. Macron will meet on Monday with former socialist Prime Minister Bernard Cazeneuve, a political figure seen as a frontrunner to head the French government. Cazeneuve has already served as Prime Minister under François Hollande. However, in 2022, he left the Socialist Party. He's a representative of the French's left's most centrist-leaning fringe and has long been at odds with Jean-Luc Mélenchon's left-wing France Unbowed. Cazeneuve cannot be considered a left-leaning prime minister if he does not have the support of the 4 political components of the left in the National Assembly, said Manuel Bompard, who was representing France Unbowed in the NFP negotiations. Now, Cog, what do you make of this? I mean, Macron is saying, we can't have a left-wing prime minister, despite the left winning the elections, because it will create a crisis. But by blocking the candidate most deserving of the role, I mean, that's creating the crisis, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think the worst thing it does is create instability. But the thing is he'd already created that instability with the by calling the snap election in the first place. It seems like bad luck for incumbent politicians to call snap elections. I mean, look at Theresa May. Like, it doesn't seem to go well for the incumbent generally, a snap election, especially arrogant neoliberals who are faced by left-wing opponents seem to like overplay their hand quite a bit. Now, of course, it was the left who saved Macron, literally saved him from having to deal with a government headed by Marine Le Pen, which he might have had to deal with. And now Macron has decided that actually he's going to turn on the new Popular Front, the party that, the coalition of parties that hold the plurality of votes in the French Parliament, sort of break with all parliamentary tradition throughout history. and say that the party that got 180 out of 577 seats and 25% of the total vote, the plurality of votes, if another party had got more, fair enough. But this coalition got the plurality of the votes. The idea that they shouldn't get to choose the prime minister, it doesn't work. It's such an interference, especially when you consider that the French bill on the rights of man, I think it's like number 13 to do with democracy, said about separation of powers being so like foundational to the establishment of the French Republic and the Fifth French Republic. In particular, the separation of powers is so important in any democracy, but in this particular one, I mean, you'd expect the French to have a bit of a hold on this, and Macron clearly doesn't. Like he's clearly overplaying his hand, and it's very obvious why. Macron is like a David Cameron figure. He's a free market neolib, but he's also pro reducing the deficit, pro austerity, and the NPF, the New Popular Front, represents exactly the reverse. So if you look at their platform, they want to reverse the pension changes in 2023 that Macron made that were so unpopular in France. They want to increase the minimum wage. They want to freeze prices on food and energy, and they want to fund all of this via a wealth tax. And that is too much for Macron. So instead, he's decided to literally start negotiating with a fascist. It's a tale as old as time.
Yeah, and the NFP, I mean, there's people on the radical left inside that coalition, but obviously as you have a coalition to come together, you have compromise, and their platform isn't really radical. It's maybe centre left at best. And what you pointed to there is that's still too much for Macron. Now, Macron cannot be considered centrist. I mean, he should be considered centre-right at least. I mean, look, during his time in power, he pandered to reactionary politics such as Islamophobia. And what we're seeing here is Macron going against the democratic mandate and siding with conservatives and the far right, which includes fascists, to make sure the left can't govern. So, I mean, Macron should absolutely be seen as a right-wing politician. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think that Macron should be seen as a right-wing politician, but it's important to understand the kind of right-wing politician he is. He is the enabler. He sees himself, unfortunately, rather arrogantly, as the heir to Charles de Gaulle. Like that's how he sees himself. Like France's like big 20th century political figure. Like our equivalent would be Boris Johnson and Winston Churchill. And the danger of turning to wartime leaders for guidance, for our inspiration, is that we tend to, I say we, the leaders tend to take on this facade of like wartime politics where you can do things that would only be acceptable in wartime, like interfering with another branch of government in this way instead of letting it play out, because there's no real reason why you shouldn't let it play out. Okay, you think that the government would just collapse in on itself and you'd have to call another election. Okay, that's fine. That creates less instability than if you interfere and use the president's branch of the government to interfere with the parliament. It's such a bad idea.
I think it's clear that using crisis or unstable government is a smokescreen, because as I kind of alluded to earlier, there's a crisis right now. Okay, obviously you pointed out that Macron kind of started this crisis by calling the election, being very arrogant, losing it. But right now it's at a stalemate because he's denying the democratic will of the people. They should get their candidate, and now he's creating even more crisis. So I think that's a smokescreen. But also it's interesting because he said Parliament will veto any left-wing candidate. So what's the options here for the left? If the left get their candidate, I can see it being very likely that Parliament will try to oust them, because no one, apart from the left wing, wants there to be a left-wing government. Or if Macron still won't support their candidate, what can they do? I mean, are they forced to go ahead with Macron's ideal pick, or what do you see happening?
I think they've got to fight tooth and nail against Macron's ideal pick, because he's falling into the trap of assuming that the danger comes from the left, and it so rarely does in these situations. He's like straight away fallen into that sort of neoliberal way of thinking, that the big threat is going to come from the left, and that the stable thing to do, the thing you can do, is negotiate with the right, but just control them. Just get enough, just a little bit of far right. But all that ends up happening is you end up dragging politics to the right. And you need to understand, in any political system, and this is true in the UK as well, you've got to be more scared of the radicals on the side that hold political power. Like, if your government leans to the right, then you want to be afraid of radicals on the right. And that's true for many countries throughout the world right now. If your government leans to the left, there are a few countries, then you want to be frightened about radicals to your left, because it's going to be pushing the political spectrum one way or the other. What Macron needs to realize is that you can't control that. You don't want to be pushing to the right, but there's very little that the left-wing coalition can do to actually influence that. At the end of the day, Macron is making the mistake here, not the left-wing coalition.
Macron is following in the great centrist tradition of siding with the far right over the left. You sort of alluded to that earlier, and it's happened multiple times throughout history. I mean, in the 1919 German Revolution, it was a socialist revolution in Imperial Germany towards the end of World War II, but they were undermined by the SPD, working with the fascists. In the 70s, you had a Western coup of socialist Allende. He was democratically elected, but was forced out, and Pinochet was installed. He was a fascist dictator. And you have liberals today who largely side with Israel over Palestine. And both liberals and fascists want to protect capitalism. They have a common interest. And the whole existence of liberals and their ideology is to keep to the current system and to sometimes make small changes within it. And fascists have no desire, excuse me, to overthrow capitalism. The ideology of fascism is racism, authoritarianism, and to eliminate what they consider degeneracy. And none of this is in conflict with capital. Now, the left, obviously, we want to change the system and to overthrow capitalism, despite liberals claiming they share the same values of leftists, which is freedom, liberty, tolerance, equality. None of these things really matter to liberals. Their core principle is to only make changes that are within the parameters of the current system. And on the left, we have a critical analysis of the material world. We understand that in order to address the issues of racism, of inequality, we have to address capitalism. But for liberals, they have no understanding or have any analysis of the material world, and it's just vibes. You know, everything's about ideas. Yet they don't understand that ideas are forms from the material conditions people find themselves in. And given the fact that liberals don't have a material basis in the worldview, some believe that all of the issues in the world can be addressed under the current system, and this leads to some of them to come to the conclusion that the left are more dangerous than the right, and that's because only the left want to dismantle current systems and structures, whereas the right don't. And when you take all of that into account, the so-called centrists and liberals say they're the pragmatic ones, but they're just as ideological, if not more, than the left and the right.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's the danger of political instability. Just before anything like this happens, just before a rise of the far right, there is always this chopping and changing of politicians, and it is a warning sign, and one that Macron should be looking at from history. The French should know all too well, given French history, given that they were literally occupied by the most prominent far right government of the 20th century. It should be a warning sign to them, but I don't know. Macron doesn't seem to be learning any lessons, but I'm still hopeful that there are people in France who are like switched on to the idea that the rise of the far right is a far bigger threat than anything that the left could be presenting by, taxing some rich people on their profits.
I agree. But let's move on to our second story. Labour, far from the party of workers, it seems they are now the party of slum landlords. Now, Jazz Athwell, Labour MP, was in the news a couple of weeks ago after it was revealed that he was a landlord with a portfolio of 18 properties, making him the biggest landlord in the Commons. Now, that in of itself surprised some, as most would have expected the largest landlord to come from the Conservative Party. But he's been in the news again after it was uncovered that he wasn't the best landlord either, and that's putting it mildly. His tenants, whom with some he shares the same constituency with, have been complaining about the poor conditions of his properties. A BBC report was released after investigations correspondent Joe Pike went to these flats himself. In one block of 7 flats owned by Mr. Athwell, nearly half the tenants said they had to regularly clean their bathroom ceilings to remove mould. On top of the black mold, the BBC saw evidence of ant infestations in a number of the 7 properties. The ants are everywhere, one resident said, pointing to insects climbing up a doorframe. There are on my kids' body and on their clothes. Another resident said they have been threatened with eviction by letting agent if they complained about problems in their flats or started claiming benefits. Now, as you can see, these are some of the pictures Joe Pike took when he was at the properties, which is disgusting, if you ask me. But it's not just the poor conditions these renters are subjected to. They face intimidation and are threatened if they speak out. When I visited the properties, which are above an empty shop in Ilford, the communal areas were dirty and the lights did not work. Fire alarms were hanging loose from the ceiling and a washing machine had been dumped next to a set of stairs. I knocked on every door and spoke to most of the tenants. None wanted their name to be used. Some specifically said this was due to a fear of being evicted. Please don't use my name, said a resident. Finding a new flat is very difficult. Most of the people I spoke to said Mr. Athwell and his property manager were slow to respond to complaints or were completely unresponsive. While I was at the block, the property manager was tipped off about my visits and tenants started to get calls from him. After receiving these calls, they became hesitant about talking to me. This appeared to me to be intimidation. One resident had spoken on camera about problems with the flats, later asked that we not use the interview, and another asked me not to use images of the mold 2 days after, allowing me to take pictures of it. Now, initially, Athwell completely downplayed the investigation and said, there's nothing wrong. In his first response to the BBC, Mr. Athwell did not respond to a request for interview, but said, my properties are managed by an agency selected for their quick response times and excellent customer service. This is evidenced by the long tenure of the tenants, over 87 years across 15 properties. I pride myself on being a good landlord, and no tenants have ever been evicted. Repairs and improvements have been made to properties as recently as 2 years ago. To ensure tenants enjoy a secure, long-term home, rents are kept below market rates, and in many cases, rents are frozen at the rate first agreed. He added he did not take on tenants on housing benefit to avoid conflicts of interest with his role as the local council leader. Now, it's very interesting that, he talks about not taking on tenants with housing benefits to avoid conflict of interest. And I love how he says, I'm a good landlord. I've not made anyone homeless yet. I mean, way to set the bar incredibly low. Also saying that he must be good because tenants are stuck around. I mean, clearly he's completely out of touch. Tenants would more likely move if it was easier to find another property, or the fact, it's their home. They would like the issues to be fixed rather than be upended every 6 months to a year. Just an incredibly out of touch thing to say. Now, after much backlash, as you would expect, Athwell changed his tune just a little bit, and instead of downplaying the issue, he decided to apologise. But still, within the apology, he doesn't take full responsibility. I'm shocked and sickened by the series of problems that have come to light. I had not been aware of these issues until this week, for which I'm furious. I have immediately dismissed the managing agent of my properties. As the landlord, the buck stops with me, and I unreservedly apologise to my tenants for the unacceptable experiences they have endured. I will be reimbursing every tenant that is out of pocket for repairs or renewals they have had to undertake. I will be conducting a survey of my tenants so that all issues are uncovered, and I'm confident each one is living in secure, comfortable homes. So he apologises and says, the buck stops with me. However, he goes on to say that he had no idea about any of this, and he fired the property managers. Cog, pretty astonishing. What do you think should happen to Jazz Arwell?
Well, I think he should not be suspended. I think he should stay exactly where he is because he represents exactly the problem with Starmer's Labour. He represents the issue that Starmer's Labour has, where it has, like Macron, rejected the left, and now it has to deal with what it's left with. Right? It has to deal with people like Jazz Afwal that it has catapulted into positions of power simply to satisfy a feud with the left. Morgan McSweeney, Luke Akehurst, all of these figures who've got a very petty, vindictive student politics argument against anyone even vaguely left wing. And now the kind of politics they've created is just open to exploitation. It's open to people who, far from embodying the values of the Labour Party that we used to associate with the Labour Party, far from embodying the idea of like workers' rights, of Fabianism and social democracy, and standing up for the people at the bottom. Now we've got people like Jazz Afwal, who clearly they might say that that they're supporting workers. They might say that they are might say that they are of the left. But I think there's a fundamental contradiction there between what they're saying and what they're doing.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that there was some controversy when Athwell became the candidate for Ilford South, and it was previously held by Sam Tarry, who was seen on the left of the party. He was sacked from the shadow cabinet by Keir Starmer for standing on a picket line. He was then subsequently deselected, although Tarry said at the time that he believed there was dodgy practices that led to the deselection. Now, the media, they're going to just sort of isolate this. It's a Jazz Athwell issue, right? But they're missing the bigger picture. Now, what we do is to look at the entire thing. This isn't an isolated issue with one MP, but rather a systemic change within the Labour Party where they seek to represent not renters, not workers, but people with a lot of capital. Jazz Athwell exists because Keir Starmer's Labour Party exists, and you pretty much alluded to that. Actually, it's quite refreshing to hear you say he shouldn't resign or be suspended because he's right at home, and that's exactly you've hit the nail on the head there, haven't you? But I thought it was funny that he refused to take on tenants who are claiming housing benefits due to a conflict of interest. I mean, him being a landlord is a conflict of interest. How can he represent renters? When they have less rights, well, if they have less rights, if they have less regulation, that literally benefits him. And he's an MP who writes our laws. I mean, some of his tenants live in the same constituency. So imagine, just think about this, being a tenant in Ilford South, and you go to one of his surgeries and complain about your living conditions, and the guy who's meant to do something about it is your bloody landlord. Cog, what do we need to do as a society to change things holistically to deal with the crisis of being a private tenant? If Athwell were to resign, which I think he should, but you kind of make the case that he should stay where he is because he's right at home. That doesn't change anything, does it?
I think there are big questions about the general state of housing in this country, but I do just want to go back slightly, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Because the story with Sam Tarry and Jazz Athwell goes back a little bit further than that, to the 2019 general election. So this and the reason that I'm telling this story is because centrists will try to use this to misrepresent what happened. So in 2019, on the week of the selection vote, Jazz Athwell was finally suspended after a considerably long investigation by an independent body, which was investigating him for serious allegations of sexual assault. Now, he was cleared of these allegations, to be very clear. He was cleared of these allegations. That's not what's up for question here. But at the time, Wes Streeting, our friend Wes Streeting, friend of the show, Wes Streeting, accused the Corbin's Labour and Sam Tarry, who was was also in that race, of setting up a stitch up. They said, oh well, Jazz Athwell is being stitched up by this investigation, and regardless of the outcome of the investigation, I think it's worth noting, if you're going to argue that both Jeremy Corbyn and Sam Tarry openly, it's a matter of record, called for the selection vote to be suspended at the time, right? So that more candidates could enter the ballot, so that it wouldn't just be slanted in favour of Sam Tarry because the right's most popular candidate had been removed from the process by an independent investigation. But of course, people on the right, Wes Streeting in particular, will say that this is, that was the left stitching up Jazz Athval. And then they'll say what we're doing is just like for like. We are stitching up elections, but it's okay because the left did it first. It's a misrepresentation. The left did not do it first. That Jeremy Corbyn actually went out of his way to intervene in the process in order to stop the vote. And support the BAME politicians who were concerned that Jazz Athval was being sidelined, and they reopened the vote on Jeremy Corbyn's and Sam Tarry's request, and Sam Tarry still won. So I think it's always worth going over the right-wing argument for Sam Tarry is that this feud started a long time ago and Sam Tarry started it, and going, that's not quite true. As for landlords, sorry, long answer. Hierarchy is always going to be the issue, right? The problem isn't that individual landlords are good or bad. Yeah, individual landlords are good or bad. Some of the nicest people I've known, I've known as a person, have been landlords. They're perfectly lovely people. But of course, the problem is that they're set up in a system that is designed for exploitation. It's just designed that way. What I'm thinking about at the moment is the sort of Robin Hood analogy, right? You've got King Richard, who's supposedly the good king, and Prince John, who's the baddie, who rules England and charges everyone too much tax and all that stuff. But that's only possible under a feudal system, right? The problem there is not Prince John is bad, and if King Richard was in charge, it would be good, because if King Richard's son, happened to be a tyrant, then it would be just as bad again. The problem is you have to break the system that allows landlords or kings to have power over people in this way. And one of the ways you do that is not by making Jazz Athval personally resign. I think actually he's a great representative, as I said, of what Keir Starmer's Labour looks like. Instead, it's to invest in quality social housing for different income brackets, for all different income brackets, and eventually move us to a world without landlords, because we should have a world without landlords, because, it's not a job. It's just not a job. It's not an occupation. Owning something is not a job. You work for jobs.
That was a very good explanation to the system. And I know that a lot of people will accuse the left of just saying, oh, you hate all landlords. And that's a misrepresentation of our argument. We're talking about the system. We don't want people to be in a position where they can rent out for private gain. And of course, when you create that system, you do create a lot of bastards. And I would be comfortable saying that majority of landlords probably aren't decent people. They're not evil like some, but I don't think they're necessarily decent. And there is, of course, some who are, but that's it's about the system, and you've perfectly laid that out. But of course, I agree with you. If you ask me, private landlords should not exist. I mean, the only form of renting should be by the state. I think it's rented out at cost price or as close to it as possible, and not a single person should be making a profit from housing. And to go further, I mean, we should completely decommodify housing. All housing should be free. And no, this isn't some crazy policy. We can afford it. Housing is a human right. Being left to the market, now that is crazy. But we will move on. Now, before we go into our next story, I just want to say, if you like what we do, you can subscribe and share our content. There are now 5 of us contributing to Turn Left. However, it is all still voluntary. And in order for us to dedicate more time to Turn Left, to upgrade the quality, as you can see, our graphics are getting a bit better as they are. And to become a fully realized media organization, you can support us on Patreon for £3 or £5 per month, or any one-off donation at patreon.com/turnleftmedia. Let's grow a socialist media alternative to take on the establishment commentariat, and you can be part of the journey. I will quickly correct myself. You can't do one-off donations on Patreon. I thought you could. You can't. They don't offer that service. So we did set up something else because some people were asking about it. It's called Ko-Fi. So if you go to ko-fi.com/turnleft, then you can send any one-off donation. All of that will be very helpful. Now, on to our next story. Jeremy Corbyn has officially formed an independent alliance along with 4 other MPs. Jeremy Corbyn is among 5 independent MPs to have formed an independence alliance, a group opposing inequality and war. The former Labour leader joined 4 other independents elected in July, forming the group, which is the 5th biggest bloc in Parliament. The other members are Shokat Adam, who defeated Labour frontbencher Jonathan Ashworth in Leicester South, as well as Ayub Khan, Adnan Hussein, and Iqbal Mohammed, who also stood on pro-Gaza tickets. The group said its aim is to boost the opportunity for the independent MPs to ask questions and hold the government to account. In a joint statement, the MP said, "We were elected by our constituents to provide hope in a parliament of despair." Now, a while back, Jeremy Corbyn did signal an alliance with other independent MPs, but he also spoke about a possible alliance with the SNP. Now, obviously, they're not in this group, but that's understandable because being in a political party, it's sort of a group itself. Many MPs in political parties wouldn't have the autonomy to join an official group that's not affiliated with said party. Now, I'm sure there will be many media figures who will attack this. Anything involving Jeremy Corbyn or standing up for Palestinians will draw some interesting takes. And I've already found one. A tweet from a Lib Dem supporter said this: Jeremy Corbyn's new independent alliance joins Reform UK as the only parliamentary groupings to feature no women and be 100% male. And I was expecting all sorts, but this, excuse me, this was frankly pathetic. It seems relevant to bring up this meme, though, where brown people are being bombed. At least it's been done by a woman. He forgets the facts. They are not a political party, and there are no women independent MPs. Plus, there's 5 of them. So what? It's just cringeworthy liberal identity politics. It means nothing. It's just pure virtue signaling. Now, the Independent Alliance is a bigger bloc than the Green Party, who have 4 MPs, and are on par with Reform, who have 5. Cog, do you think this is a significant development? I mean, could these 5 independents push the narrative? Could they work with other MPs and other parties on specific policies, or would they be about as effective as the Socialist Campaign Group?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how it's used. Like, pressure groups can be effective, but it's largely all about good comms. An advantage that they do have is that they have a sort of natural group leader in Jeremy Corbyn as the person who's kind of brought them together. You know, they don't all have to follow his direction, but one of the things that's lacking in a lot of the kind of informal socialist groups that exist in the UK and the US is a definite kind of hierarchy. Now, I've just spent several minutes going hierarchy is bad. Actually, in some cases, it can be good, but it depends how the hierarchy is formed, whether the hierarchy in itself is justified. I think in this case, we're talking, unlike in the case of landlords who don't do anything to like earn the money that they take, they just own stuff and they produce wealth by owning stuff. Jeremy Corbyn has proven himself as a politician and somebody who can, you know, he's not the best speaker, but he's a pretty good speaker. And he's also, he's got the experience that this group could use and exploit. But if you're going to be a pressure group, you have to understand how to use soft power influence. You should always be talking to the other parties. You should always be seeking to influence, to make, other connections where you can. It's knowing how to affect change like that. It's knowing how to use your soft power, which has made the European Research Group on the right and the sort of UKIP adjacent coalition so effective in pushing the political zeitgeist towards things like Brexit, towards pushing the Conservative Party towards Brexit. what I'm hoping is that the Independents and the Greens and all of these groups can eventually begin to move the Labour Party leftwards and counteract some of this push that we've had from the Conservatives rightward. But they are, I've got to be honest, it's not all on them, because they are working against the grain of history. Typically, after a big financial crash like the 2008 financial crash and the COVID crisis, countries do swing rightwards. It's just a fact. For the next couple of decades, they will tend to swing to the right. But that's not to say it's hopeless. With groups like this and their soft power influence, there's a good chance that we could swing things to the left again.
Now, according to the BBC, the Independent Alliance spoke to the former 7 Labour MPs. I mean, they had the whip removed for voting against the 2-child benefit cap. But it seems none of those 7 are willing to join. They've not really said anything. I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, do you think they should? Or is it a bad idea? Because that would mean they 100% wouldn't be allowed back into the party. Or do you think if those 7 MPs join this alliance, they would actually have more power than being inside the Labour Party?
I do think that they would have more power outside of the party than they would inside the party. However, I think if they wait and join when Labour's popularity inevitably drops even further than it currently is, it'll be much harder to dismiss them as like a few radicals who are angry at the fact that we deselected them. You know, it would be easy to dismiss them as kind of like, oh, just these triggered lefties. We don't have to worry about what they think. They're not anything we should worry about. We're serious grown-up politicians. But if you're in the
that framing triggers me when I hear people say grown-up politicians. It sends shockwaves in me. Sorry, I interrupted you. Carry on.
No, you're right though. It's extremely annoying language. It's a theme of this, like going back to the Macron story. It's the kind of the liberal centrist who they assume that because they are willing to adopt any position that comes from the right, that's the same thing as persuading people towards their political positions, and it's just not. They're just moving the country further and further right in whatever way it is. But when we're talking about this particular group inside the Labour Party at the moment, they probably have more power, not because they have power to influence the Labour Party, but because they can choose their moment for when they drop out of the Labour Party, for when they choose to rebel. It's their ability to rebel and rebel very publicly that gives them a lot of like soft power in this situation. I'm not, to be clear, because I know there's going to be people in the comments saying this, I am not saying that they would have power inside the Labour Party. In fact, I think the people inside the Labour Party right now are losing power as Keir Starmer begins to reform the leadership of the Labour Party to make it so that members can't vote for the leader. That's only going to end in disaster. It's only going to end in an increasingly authoritarian streak reaching its peak.
I definitely agree with you that I don't think it would be a good idea for any of those 7 to join now. Maybe bide your time and wait for Labour to be weakened, because in the eyes of the public, they are looking quite weak. The latest polling is actually abysmal. They're only 4 points ahead of the Conservatives. They're on 30%, the Tories on 26%. Really astonishing. But structurally, they still have a huge majority. They still have a lot of power. And I think it's probably wise to wait maybe a couple of years. But it's also, this is a starting point, right? There's only 5 independent MPs, but there could be a huge sort of groundswell of independent MPs getting elected. Most famously, or one of the famous ones is Liam Mohammed coming within 500 votes of beating Wes Streeting. There's no reason why she couldn't win in the next election. I mean, given how unpopular the Labour Party are right now, unless they do some drastic changes, they're going to be very unpopular in the next election. I expect them to win, but maybe on a smaller majority. And in those instances where they get a smaller majority, they lose seats to someone like Liam Mohammed, and it adds more to this independent group. You know, it could be at the next election 10 independent MPs, and that could be a real force. So really interesting dynamic going on there. I look forward to seeing it, but we'll have to wait and see. But we will go on to our next story. The police have charged the co-founder of Palestine Action under the Terrorism Act. The co-founder of Palestine Action has been charged with violating the Terrorism Act after a series of speeches in Manchester and Bradford. Richard Barnard stands accused of expressing an opinion that is supportive of a prescribed organisation contrary to Section 12 of the Terrorism Act 2000. Barnard, 41, will appear before the Westminster Magistrates Court on the 18th of September, where he also faces 2 charges of encouraging or intending to encourage criminal damage. The charges stem from an investigation by the Specialised Counter-Terrorism Policing Northwest Unit into a demonstration held on the 8th of October in Manchester after Hamas launched an attack on southern Israel. So what kind of criminal damage has activists caused as Palestine Action? The activist was a member of the Filton 10 who dismantled the research hub of Israel's biggest weapon firm, Elbit Systems. The action caused over £1 million in damage to the heavily guarded Filton-based research hub of Israel's biggest weapons producer, which was opened in the summer of 2023. In total, 10 activists have been charged in connection to the Filton action, all of whom were first detained without charge for nearly a week and interrogated constantly under the powers granted by the Terrorism Act. So activists in the group haven't taken to the streets to riot and damage people's homes or businesses. They haven't set hotels on fire. They've specifically targeted weapon systems that is used for the ongoing genocide in Gaza. But the police haven't just targeted Richard. They've gone after journalists too. Richard Medhurst was being one, and Sarah Wilkinson, who was also a Palestine supporter. On the same day, counter-terror cops also arrested prominent journalist and Palestine Action supporter Sarah Wilkinson for online posts. This authoritarian overreach of state power to silence a journalist could breach international law. Specifically, it could contravene Resolution 2022 of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council said this: the Council condemns unequivocally all attacks and violence against journalists and media workers, such as torture, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrest, and arbitrary detention, as well as intimidation and harassment in both conflict and non-conflict situations. Well, that certainly sounds like it applies here, and indeed is an overreach on authoritarian power. Cog, let's start off with Barnard. So he's the co-founder of Palestine Action. He's been charged under the Terrorism Act because apparently he's shown support for Hamas. I want to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that we've got to be extremely careful when we're using anti-terrorist powers, particularly in the case like post 9/11. I think post 9/11, we've got to be really, really careful about how much we let the state creep in to abusing the powers that were given to it supposedly to keep us safe. And I do think it's concerning, but in fairness, I haven't seen like the full extent of the reasons that they have decided to charge him. I'll be interested to read any court documents that are released. And I think we just have to be careful about any double standards being applied here. Stuff to do with the Middle East, stuff to do with people from the Middle East invariably associated with terrorism. Stuff to do with white people always gets the benefit of the doubt. I think that, and you know, I don't know whether Richard Barnard himself is white or not, but it's kind of irrelevant because the big question here is what's he associated with? And it's associated with Palestine, and too often Palestine and terrorism are lumped in together. Despite the very obvious examples of far right Israeli terrorism. I mean, the literal assassination of oh god, his name's gone from my head. Yitzhak Rabin, the former Israeli PM, literally killed by far right radicals in Israel. But yeah, it's Palestine that's associated with terrorism. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I don't know a whole lot about this particular topic. It's not something that I'm well versed on.
I mean, this is the problem, though, when we run into governments who declare certain organizations as terrorists. Now, of course, you can understand when it's groups that directly want to harm a country, and being seen as supportive of that, you can make the case that some are a threat to our security. But then look and see how Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist by Thatcher, and those who stood against apartheid in South Africa, they were arrested and accused of being terrorist sympathizers. Now, of course, Mandela was certainly no terrorist, and I'm not here trying to make the case that Hamas aren't. But what I am saying is, being against the genocide of the Palestinians, the state will lump you in as a Hamas supporter. And what that is doing is criminalizing those who are standing up against a grave crime. I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah. Do I agree with them with them doing that, or do I agree with your assessment? Sorry.
My assessment, yeah. I mean,
yes, I agree with your assessment.
How the state is lumping anyone as a sort of a Hamas supporter or a terrorist when they're not.
Yeah, I think that is that is broadly I think correct. Again, not something that I'm well versed in this particular area. But I think that we've got to be careful about the just criminalizing dissent as opposed to actually keeping national security at the top of the agenda. And if we're keeping national security at the top of the agenda, it does always have to be borne in mind that most terrorism is homegrown, and that there is a growing threat from the far right that is almost never spoken about in these conversations.
You're absolutely right. And the thing is, though, look, if the government were really concerned about security, if that's all what it is, then why are journalists targeted too? I mean, Richard Medhurst was stopped at an airport. He was detained and arrested under the Terrorism Act. Sarah Wilkinson was arrested for posting online. Now, of course, they don't pose a threat. They're journalists. So obviously we know this is a smokescreen and it's about silencing dissent. I also think that what I find striking is that when the race riots happened, you had fascists set hotels on fire with children inside, physically attacking random people on the street, and they were charged with violent disorders. Yet Palestine Action targeted big companies making money off killing innocents. These activists didn't harm anyone, right? So I want to ask, why were these riots charged, not charged under the Terrorism Act, even though they literally spread terror based on their political beliefs? But journalists and activists are being seen as terrorists by the state. You know, they have little power already, and they're trying to do their best to stop, you know, our complicity in the actions of Israel. You mentioned that no one really talks about the far right. Why is there sort of a double standard here?
Yeah, I mean, you said they were fascists. I think you'll find they were pro-British protesters. Was the phrase that was used about them, right?
Yeah,
pro-British protesters. The kind of disconnect there is huge. But when it comes to terror, so the way I was taught it when I in my political science lessons from uni, because I did history and politics at uni, and we had to do a degree of international relations, and the way that we were taught was like the universal definition of terrorism is using violence or the fear of violence upon citizens, upon civilians, in order to try to enact some political change, to try to enact political change. But by this definition, given the what happened on October 7th, relatively small fry compared to what the terrorist state of Israel has actually done since, but it falls under the Terrorism Act. It does. It falls under the Terrorism Act, the definition of terrorism. Now, UK law works slightly differently. What falls under the Terrorism Act is determined by what is a terrorist organization and, you know, a classified terrorist organization. However, I think it's pretty undeniable that by the same standards that you would apply there, by the standard of, X group is trying to influence the government policy by using fear, intimidation, and violence against the civilian population, the riots fit that definition. They are right-wing terrorists, and they should have been called right-wing terrorists. But the way that UK law works doesn't actually line up with the reality of how we talk about and understand terrorism.
I completely agree. But we will move on. Let's continue. I think we go to some of our comments. So we've got a few in, and by the way, keep them coming. We like feedback. We like interacting with our viewers. Let's go to our first one. Edward Sexby: Macron takes Popular Front votes, then ditches the left and negotiates with the fascists. Anyone still trust Liberals? The polite fash anymore? United Front, not Popular Front, is needed. It's all cynical, though. Of course, he will take as many left-wing votes as he can get, and he will turn on them. I mean, it's kind of similar to the Labour Party, although Keir Starmer kind of did turn around and say, if you don't like what we're doing, you can piss off. But you think that Keir Starmer would say no to left-wing votes? No, but he absolutely will not serve them. Let's go to another. Luna Rose 161. You know what they say about Liberals, Curtis? Macron just did the meme unironically. Oh, they say a lot of things about Liberals, and I can certainly say a lot of things about Liberals. Don't think I can say everything, though, because this will probably get demonetized. Let's go to another. Flow Snake. Good to see you again. Fun fact, Jazz Athwell is an anagram of J. Ashwalt, which is almost the same as J. Ashworth. Coincidence? I don't think so. You might be onto something. I mean, Jazz Athwell seems to be moaning a little bit that he's been targeted. I mean, that John Ashworth can't seem to get off the airways crying about his election loss. I wish we could get rid of him, but he seems like he's here to stay, especially that he's with the think tank Labour together. Good observation. Stanley Beckett's thoughts. There are 44 Labour MPs that are landlords. Yes, there are so many of them, and it just shows that Jazz Athwell is the biggest one, bigger than some Conservative MPs. He asked me, if you're a landlord, you shouldn't be an MP. You shouldn't be allowed. I mean, I don't think if you're drawing an income of something that isn't from a wage as being an MP, then there's a conflict of interest there. I mean, it was right when Jeremy Corbin said that his front bench aren't allowed to have second jobs. Keir Starmer said he would sort that out. He didn't. And in fact, loads of Labour shadow cabinet members were on LBC, Good Morning Britain, whatever. It's all a farce. Chris, shocking our country commits genocide while arresting activists for trying to stop the genocide. Indeed. But that's what happens when, our country is complicit. They are going to lock up and attack those who are trying to do the right thing and be, let's be honest, lenient. I mean, I wouldn't say lenient, but a two-tier police, actually, to borrow the phrase, on the far right. Aidan Wellsmith, known antagonist to this channel. Some of the worst housing is council housing. Local to me, 60 families kicked out because the block is dangerous. Cog, I know you want to take this one on.
Yeah,
Fire away.
I asked to come up for this one because I saw the comment and I was like, I can't resist. I'm going to take the bait. So first of all, that's entirely anecdotal. The 60 families thing, can't find any reference to it. But even so, your method of accountability in democracy is different to that in a private landlord situation. Now, to be clear, when I say I'm in favor of social housing, I mean housing owned and produced and maintained by the government. That is rented out to the population at a reasonable price, preferably at no price. Preferably, there should be social housing available for those who most need it at a price which is reasonable. But the regulation of social housing did a study in 2022 and found that less than 0.2% of social housing has damp and mold problems. If you've lived in private accommodation, you have probably dealt with damp and mold problems. So I know for a fact that damp and mold problems are a big problem in private accommodation. The idea that social housing the idea that social housing, the idea that council housing is crap housing is it's created by our system. It's created by our system, which has underfunded council and social housing, but it still doesn't even work. It doesn't even come close to working because actually the evidence shows that 0.2% have damp and mold problems, a very, very small percentage compared with private rented accommodation, where the incentive is to actually not deal with that damp and mold problem, because there's not somebody at the top of that hierarchy who might lose their job at the next election if they don't get it.
Very well said. But we will move on to our final story of the evening. Some slightly positive news is that David Lammy has announced that the government will suspend 30 arms export licenses to Israel. Mr. Lammy said the decision comes following a review of export licenses for UK arms, which found there was a clear risk that they would be used in a way that could breach international law. Around 30 of 350 licenses will be suspended, Mr. Lammy said. He said, facing a conflict such as this, it is this government's legal duty to review Britain's export licenses. This is not a blanket ban. This is not an arms embargo. Now, as you heard there, this isn't a complete ban on weapons, and it's only 30 out of 350. And I'm going to rephrase myself at the beginning when I said it's slightly positive. It's not really positive at all, is it? Now, we covered on Turn Left last week that the UK Attorney General wanted to step in and stop any ban, and his reasoning was because they couldn't differentiate between offensive and defensive weapons. Now, given that Labour have come out with some suspensions, does that mean that they have somehow worked out what weapons are used for offense and what's for defense? Cog, what do you make of this story? I mean, it broke literally a few hours ago. I guess I want to ask, why only 30 out of 350?
Doesn't make any sense, does it? Because either this either these weapons are being used by a state which is in danger of violating international law, which is in breach potentially of the Genocide Convention, Article 1, which says that the signatory states have a duty to prevent or punish genocide. Either it is or it isn't. It doesn't make sense to only cancel weapons contracts that are offensive, or only cancel some weapons contracts, because I don't know of any weapons that could be used for a genocide in one case that couldn't equally be replaced with another set of standard military arms used by a modern military like Israel has, like the IDF has, the IOF as they're becoming known, because it's becoming blatantly obvious that Israel is an occupation force, not a defense force. The IDF not really defending a lot. It's more about occupation than defense. Why 30 out of 350? Well, you're telling me that those are the only 30 weapons contracts that have offensive capabilities? I don't think so. I think this is the Labour government's attempt to be able to sort of cover their backsides in the very likely event that Israel, which is already becoming a pariah state, begins to collapse in on itself. And they have to do the former Rhodesia thing of going, well, we never really supported that anyway. Look, we suspended some arms in 2024. They're trying to cover for themselves in a way that really doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and this is a story that sounds better as a headline. Oh, Labour are holding Israel to account by banning weapons, but the detail, they're not banning most of them, just some licenses. And look, this is still speculation. We don't have more information. But if you ask me, I still maintain that you truly can't know the difference between an offensive weapon and a defensive one. Israel will lie. Guess what? Israel are liars. I mean, what do you make of that? Because anything less than the blanket ban isn't good enough, is it?
Yeah, I think that it's our duty to impose a blanket ban, because we know that according to the ICJ ruling, that there is a risk of genocide here. We know that there's the potential for genocide to be committed here. And according to Article 1, we have a duty to prevent or punish genocide. It's literally called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. We have a clear international duty, unambiguously, to seek to prevent what is going on in Palestine. And I say Palestine because it's not just Gaza. Things are getting worse in the West Bank, and it's becoming very obvious that the war is going to expand. I say war. it's not really a war, it's a genocide. I'm saying war, but I think it's important to say war because the Genocide Convention is also clear that it doesn't matter whether it's in wartime or in peacetime, genocide must still be prevented or punished. There's no excuse for it. I think that we 100% have a duty to step in here, cut off arms, and speed up the decline of the pariah state that is Israel. I've had so many conversations with so many Israelis and people who defend Israel, and it's becoming increasingly clear to me that they are detached from reality. And you will show them reports, and they will tell you that those reports don't exist. That the if they do exist, then they're written by people who are influenced by Hamas. Just a total disconnect. And of course, recently there's been protests against the Likud government, against Benjamin Netanyahu specifically, and his handling of the hostages after it was revealed that right in the early stage, I think it was the 9th of October, Hamas said they would release all civilian hostages in return for the IDF not entering the Gaza Strip, and Benjamin Netanyahu was like, no. And it's always been the problem, that the contradiction in the Israeli argument with the Israelis that I've argued with, where they say, oh, we just care about the hostages, and then you go, okay, so you would be willing to give like concessions of land to the Palestinians, 1948 borders, all of that stuff. You'd be willing to talk about that stuff. In return for the hostages. If the hostages are your number one priority, then you don't get to decide who the next government of Palestine is. You might not like Hamas. I don't like Hamas. I'm not keen on Hamas. But you don't get to enter a negotiation saying we are going to kill all of the other people on the other side. That's not how you negotiate, right? The Good Friday Agreement would never have gone through if the unionist side was saying, well, yeah, we'll come around the table so long as we get to kill all of the IRA members afterwards. Like, you'd never get a deal passed like that, right? The way that you get a deal passed is by coming together with people who, may have committed war crimes against each other, coming together with them and negotiating with them. But Benjamin Netanyahu is not in favor of negotiation. He's in favor of prolonging his political career. And we are helping him do that. The British government is helping him do that. And I think it's worth bearing in mind. It's speculation, but would you honestly be shocked, Curtis, if it turned out that David Lammy had been in touch with Benjamin Netanyahu, and Benjamin Netanyahu had picked out 30 defense contracts that he, didn't mind the British government getting rid of to save face?
Well, I mean, that sounds plausible. It sounds incredibly plausible. So yeah, I won't be surprised. And we have to remember, there's been multiple times where there was supposedly ceasefire talks, and Hamas have said we will release all the hostages, but you have to remove your military. And every single time Israel says, okay, you release the hostages, but we're not going anywhere. And then they'll go to the media and say, look, Hamas is, they don't want a peace deal. But every single time it's Israel, because Israel don't want it to end. Netanyahu and the government want to finish what they started, and we all know what that means. So it's important that this is noted. But I think we'll leave it there. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. I also want to thank Cog. Remember, if you enjoyed this live show, you can support Turn Left by hitting the subscribe button, giving us a thumbs up, and comment. Now, if you like our work and you want us to become full-time, then you can support us on Patreon for £3 or £5 per month. Some people have been asking about one-off donations, as I said earlier, and we realized that Patreon doesn't actually offer one-off. So we've set up Ko-Fi, spelled Ko-Fi. So you can go to ko-fi.com/turn left, and there you can give a one-off donation to help us grow. My name's Curtis Daly. Thank you, and see you next time.
Patreon.com, Turn Left Media. Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you, Turn Left.